Hey everyone, so in this video I'm going to talk about how I got my piano teacher to stop yelling at me about voicing. And I'm still in Dumbo right now, recording a series of videos here, and I'm quite enjoying it. And I feel like I've told this story a number of times, especially to my students, but I have not shared it publicly before. And for those that don't know voicing, if you play a chord or you play more than one note at the same time, like a simple definition of it is like you're able to bring out one note louder than the other notes. Maybe you can play one of the notes super loud and the other note super soft. A lot of the time we'll voice the tops of chords. That's what we call voicing. Like the top note will be louder than the other notes. So that's just a simple definition. And my teacher, he never said that he was yelling, but he sure talked loud sometimes when I didn't do the given thing well. I owe much of my career to my great teacher, so I'm eternally grateful. I'm very glad that he chastised me about this over and over and over again. And there were many themes like this that came up. For you, it might not be voicing. It might be rhythm. It might be dynamics. It might be something else. It might be technique. I certainly was chastised or yelled at for many other things over the course of my career as a student. But the thing I'm wanting to share with you guys is how I got him to stop doing that, because basically, I was a student and I wasn't making a great deal of income teaching part-time, and lessons are pretty expensive, especially with great artists. And I realized there was a period of time where I was going to lessons and basically I was being told the same thing over and over again in each lesson. I was being told other things as well, of course, but I was really struck by how he said, he explained, like, David, how do you play, how do you have excellent voicing, how do you do this well? And I would try to do it, and it would seem like it'd be fine, but then I would just get yelled at for the same thing the next week again, and this would continue for months. And I realized, like, I'm just, I keep going to lessons, I just keep being told the same thing over and over again. And I actually started to suspect if maybe I just honestly wasn't smart enough, I just wasn't talented enough to absorb this information. Like, maybe I'm just not cut out to be a pianist, right? So it was pretty depressing for a little bit. And, so these things would come up, but I would get over them. And so this is what would typically happen. Like, maybe I would voice the chords badly and then I would get chastised for it. It's like, there's no voicing, like all the notes sound the same and the sound quality isn't so good. And sometimes I'd manage to do it better in the lesson. And so then I would think, great, I know how to do this now. And I would come back the next week and I would get yelled at again. And then I would try to just practice a lot. I'd be like, okay, well, I didn't get it before, but now I'm just going to practice, like many hours a day. And I definitely ramped up my practice time, but I would still get yelled at for it. And then I thought, I just haven't been paying enough attention. And so, I took lots and lots of notes in lessons, and I paid very close attention. I always recorded every lesson. I would listen to the recording and then take notes again. It's amazing how much you miss, even though I was already taking notes nonstop in the lessons. And that still didn't solve the problem. Things got incrementally better sometimes, but it still didn't solve the larger problem. Like my voicing as a whole in my pieces, like it wasn't great. And if I brought in new material or a different piece, I would have problems in that piece. It's like without his help, I could not solve the problems of voicing on my own. And I really cared about it. I thought about it a lot. I was like, I need to care and think about this more. I need to obsess over it more, which is like what I naturally do anyway. And that still wasn't enough. I still couldn't solve the problem. Then I started recording myself. I recorded, I listened. I'm like, okay, I'm focusing now. I'm listening to the recordings. And that still wasn't enough. I made improvements. There were still little by little improvements, but it honestly wasn't good enough. Like for me, wanting to be a professional pianist, for the demands of my teacher's studio, for where I wanted to be as a pianist, both professionally and personally, I was like, I want to be able to take things to a different level. I don't want to have to rely on him to fix voicing forever. Like I want to be able to take this concept to the next level and at least like the basics, not have him yell at me again. And eventually I realized I needed to confirm essentially like every single chord one by one. Like it wasn't enough to like listen to the recording and then have like this one passage be okay and then assume that the rest of the chords are well voiced. It wasn't enough to like care and think and obsess over it and think about it all the time. That doesn't magically make all the chords well voiced. All the note taking and listening to recordings, like the recording of the lesson, the recording of my own playing, all of these things helped. It's not like I made no progress, but the reason I didn't make much greater progress was because I just wasn't literally checking the voicing of every single chord. And when I realized this, I became very, very methodical and granular about it. Like I would take, for instance, one passage, and let's say that there are, I don't know how many chords there would be in a given passage, depending on the music. I don't know, there could be like 20, 30, 50 chords, simultaneities, just groupings of 2 notes or more, 3 notes or more, 4 notes or more. And basically, like, what I would do is, for instance, I'd record that passage, listen to the recording, and then I would just check every single one. I'd be like, okay, first chord, is that voiced? And if it wasn't excellent, I was like, no, it's not voiced. Like, he's definitely going to say something about that, because he's already said this to me for like 7 consecutive weeks. And so I would check that, and then I would compare that with my own listening, right? And then I would do the same thing with the next chord, the second chord, and the third and the fourth, and just go through all like 40 or 50 chords in the passage. And then I would repeat the same process again, like the next day. And the funny thing about recording yourself, and I'm sure I'll talk about this more in another video about recording, or sometime, you become much, much better at predicting yourself. So in the beginning, you might think like, oh, this is well voiced, and then you listen and you're like, oh no, it's not, right? And of course, I'm getting expert feedback in the lessons themselves, and so just in case my own listening isn't enough. But eventually you'll reach the point where you're like, okay, I thought that this was good, but it turned out that it wasn't in the recording. So then you start to adjust, and you start to be able to predict, like, okay, this probably isn't good, and then the recording confirms it isn't good. Okay, this probably is good, because I've already listened to my own recordings like a whole bunch of times, and then it turns out that it is good, so you become better at predicting, and then ultimately you become better at listening to yourself in the moment. So by pretty obsessively checking every single chord within a given passage and repeating that day after day. And this is just with like one passage, and then I would do this with like many different passages. I started to be able to reasonably assume that every chord in a given passage was actually voiced. I had to worry about every single one. It wasn't enough to like listen carefully to 3 of them and then conclude and then think like, okay, the rest are probably voiced. That's not good enough. It wasn't enough to check the recording for like 3 of the chords and think, okay, these 3 chords, they are well voiced, so that probably means the rest of the chords in this recording are well voiced. No, that's not enough at this point either, right? So, and after I repeated this process for, I honestly don't know how long it took. I think it probably took a few months to really, really, really sink in. And it finally reached the point where not only old passages that I'd already played for him, but even new passages, I would bring them in, and at the very least I wasn't yelled at, and eventually it reached the point where I would even receive some praise. So it's funny how if logically you take care of every single, you make sure you're like, okay, I literally can hear that every single chord is voiced, well then your teacher can't chastise you about voicing. It does take a lot of time, it does take a lot of patience, and this is a pretty extreme example. You could like take this down a few orders of magnitude for a different concept, but yeah, it's not enough to just care and wish about something. Even with note reading, that most basic of things, seemingly, a lot of the time students will read the first few notes and then think like, okay, the rest of the notes, it's probably this, and there's no reason to think this, right? So I hope this little story has helped you. I have carried this mindset into many different other areas of my playing. It caused my playing to continuously climb to new levels because of this incredible attention to detail that I cultivated. And trust me, it wasn't always easy, but it's now become a part of me. And this is a topic for a different time, but if you find this process miserable and tedious, there is a way to practice over time so that you enjoy it as well. And so at the time it was rather tedious, but then over time I've just enjoyed the actual process more and more, and that's a different sort of practice. So anyway, if you found this valuable, please like, subscribe, let me know what you think in the comments, and looking forward to the next one.